Good morning. Okay, so we're going to talk about Gestalt language processing today, and I just want to bring your attention to the fact that it's titled Gestalt Language Processing 101. So there's a lot to get into with Gestalt language processing, and you could spend years talking about researching all of the different facets of it, but this is kind of like a primer course. So if you're somebody who is interested in learning a little bit more about the basics of it, you're in the right place. Just a little bit about me. A little bit about me. I'm a speech language pathologist by background. I want to make sure I have the right slides. Anyway, I have two presentations, so hopefully I have the right ones here. If not, we'll correct it. I worked as a speech language pathologist in California and New Mexico and here in Utah. I was in schools for 11 years doing preschool through transition and worked a lot, variety of different settings, but worked a lot with kids with really significant disabilities. And the training that I got coming out of my master's program, I felt like I didn't know what to do to appropriately meet the needs of my students who had complex communication needs. And so that eventually led me to go back to school. And so I finished a PhD in special education at the U a few years ago, really specializing in barriers to AAC success in school and kind of focusing on what is it that's getting in the way of kids succeeding and teams succeeding in AAC. But segueing into Gestalt language processing, when we're thinking about language processing, there's the primary model that we were all taught, which is the analytic language processing. And this is what, when we're in school, whether you're a special ed teacher or if you're learning human development, or if you're a speech pathologist, if you were taught about communication development, it is most likely that you were taught this model. So it's the model that says that kids usually get their first words about 12 months. They start labeling more and more things, usually concrete things. And then about 18 months, at 18 months, they have approximately, and this is all within ranges, they have about 50 words. And when they have 50 words, they start putting those words together and we start seeing sentences, proto-sentences. And then as they try those sentences out, they start adding some grammatical functions in there, and then they have these phrases and they have self-generative language that becomes more complex and sophisticated as they grow. And so we kind of go from this model of we learn language from single words to phrases, to self-generated sentences and sophisticated grammar. And this is the model that is the foundation for all of the language development, the way we think about language development. And it's also the model that we approach when we're taught about language intervention. Now, I graduated from my master's program in 2009, and I realized that I am now in the old folks' home as far as like when I did my training. So I am interested in knowing, just by a show of hands, if you are someone who has finished their training more recently, are you still learning this as a primary Gestalt or analytic language processing? Yeah. So this is still kind of like the gold standard of what's being taught. And I hope that changes. I'm hoping that that will change, because when you get out into your jobs and you're working like me, you realize that some of these kids don't fit the mold, right? They are not developing language in the way that we were taught that kids develop language. And so Gestalt language processing is it's a different model. It's a different way of thinking about it, because there's some of us who don't learn in this linear manner, this 1 + 1 + 2 equals 4, right? So Gestalt, it was, I think the term, somebody first used it, and I should have the person's name here, in the 1980s. But Gestalt, the word comes from the German word that means form or shape. So it kind of has this connotation of something bigger, a bigger part. And the definition within the field of psychology is that it is processing information, whether it's visual information, auditory information, linguistic information, as a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So a kind of working definition within the field of speech-language pathology is multi-word chunks that a speaker hears, stores, and uses as whole before having awareness of its internal structures. So we're kind of going backwards. Instead of thinking 1 + 1 + 2 = 4, we might be thinking another way of thinking of it from the Gestalt perspective might be that we start with 4, then we break it down into 2 and 2, or 2 and 1 and 1, or 1 and 1 and 1. But we're starting at the whole rather than the parts. And a lot of times Gestalt language processing is considered atypical if it's acknowledged at all. And I think what we find a lot is it's not acknowledged at all. So understanding starts with large whole language chunks, and then it's broken down into smaller units. So you have these chunks or gestalts or scripts. We can use a lot of different words to talk about these whole language pieces that kiddos start with. And then we go to broken down gestalts, and then single words, and then we get to generative language. So we kind of can end up at the same place, but we have a different way of getting there. And when kids are using gestalts, it can be very confusing because it might seem like they have these really sophisticated grammatical forms because they're reciting, past tense ed. If you were to do a language sample and just analyze, like we were looking at all the morphemes and okay, there's past tense ed, there's plural s, there's possessive s, but that might not truly be the case that the child understands what those grammatical morphemes are and is using them intentionally. They're just might be included in the big chunk that they're using to communicate. So language growth, instead of adding, in Gestalt language processing, language growth requires breaking it down. So in Analytic Language Model, we're taking small parts and adding them together. In Gestalt Language Processing, they're starting with a big chunk and then breaking it down. And then once it's broken down, then they can reconfigure it and build it however they want to. So this is just kind of like a compare and contrast of analytic language processing versus Gestalt language processing. So in analytic language processing, which is kind of like the bread and butter gold standard that most of us all learned, productive communication starts early. Kids are manipulating the language and the words from a really early stage. It's generative early. They're making their own words and their own phrases, their novel language from a really early stage. And it's generalized really quickly across context. And we talked, if you were here yesterday, the presenter said, in the beginning, we have these kiddos who they'll learn that they'll call all four-legged creatures dogs, so they generalize it really quickly across context, but then they really quickly learn, oh, that's a cow. And it's like almost as parents, we see it disappear before we're like, no, I'm not ready yet, because it happens so fast. So with Gestalt language processing, communication isn't always productive in the early stages. So what that means is the child might be communicating with intention, and for them, this big whole language gestalt or script, or we might call it delayed echolalia, that they're using it and it has meaning to them and it has a symbolic, the meaning that that script represents is meaningful to them, but it's not necessarily meaningful to the people that they're communicating with. And so it's not really productive communication. And what do we know? This is assistive technology. What is one of the number one things that we tell communication partners who are working with kiddos who use AAC? That we have to respond to all communication, right? We have to assume meaning, right? And one of the challenges is if we don't, because when our kids are talking to us, our toddlers and our preschoolers, you know, people, even if the model, even if the language isn't like 100% correct, like we'll model it back to them correctly. We'll say, oh, you're so silly or whatever. But sometimes when, you know, kids are working on their AAC and then they say a word that doesn't make sense to us or the context, then we're like, oh, wait, they didn't mean that. They're just messing around. They're exploring. They're, you know, but we're coaching our communication partners. No, respond, assume that there is meaning behind that. And whether there was or wasn't, your learner is going to benefit so much by you responding and assuming that they meant something. And so it's kind of the same way with Gestalt. But in the early stages, they don't always get that feedback. They're using it, but it's not always responded to. And then the Gestalt language processing can be inflexible in the early stages. Can be really rigid. And the child has to break down the chunks before they can move on to that generative stage where they can manipulate and really tailor the language to make it their own. It's often rigid, and there's a need to focus on tone and context to interpret the meaning. So a lot of the inflection and understanding, and we're going to kind of get into this in later, but really understanding the tone and the context more than the message, or just as much as the message, is important. So this is a kind of a really cute graphic that shows kind of the difference between analytic and Gestalt language processor. So the little boy who falls down, who's an analytic processor, he'll say, fall down. And then the Gestalt language processor might say, we all fall down. And that makes sense because that's an example that makes sense. We all fall down because the words make sense to us, right? But what if on their favorite cartoon show, the thing that happened when the character fell down was they said, oh, phooey, or something like that. Then that chunk might be assigned to we all fall down, or the concept of falling down, but without context, it might not make sense. And this is another graphic that I think is really helpful because it shows progression of Gestalt language processing versus analytics. So we have that 1 plus 2, you know, you're adding pieces to it on the analytic piece. They went to the park. And then she goes to putting 2 words together, play park. And then as she's developing later, she's saying, let's go to the park. Whereas the Gestalt language processor starts with the script, right? So dad says, time for school. And then the little boy says, let's get ready to rumble. Because for him, that's the script that's associated with we're transitioning, we're doing something new. And he might use let's get ready to rumble when they're transitioning from dinner to bath. It might be multi-use, but he's using kind of a big script. Let's is if we were going to break it down in a language sample, do you think that we would have like we would count that as like a contractible copula or whatever? I'm trying to remember what those all are. Do you think we would say that child has knowledge of that internal grammatical morpheme? No, probably not, because they have the whole chunk memorized. And so then the next stage is he's kind of breaking down the script. So he's still using it, but he's been able to have some flexibility and he's adding a new thing to it, taking away let's get ready to rumble, let's get ready to eat. And then further, let's get going to the park. So he's still using part of his script, but he's broken it down to make it so that it's more functional for him and that his communication partners have more context. So possible presentations of Gestalt language might be delayed echolalia. So the person has echoes and utterance after a gap of time and immediately, it's not immediately after hearing it. And then another presentation would be scripts, where the person has a memorized chunk of language and they use that memorized chunk of information in an intentional way to communicate. Okay, so I don't know about you, but getting on board and really being able to understand Gestalt language processing for me required a new way of thinking, because when I first started out and I was when I was in my grad program and when I was out in schools with special ed teachers, I heard a lot that echolalia was extra, it was vocal stimming, and it was a maladaptive behavior. So that was kind of the first things that I heard when I was kind of coming out, is that this is like not productive, it's not helpful, and in fact, it's maladaptive. It's distracting, it's keeping them from saying and learning the type of language that they need to, and we need to, this is a behavior that we need to mitigate. And from there, I kind of heard either it was negative or sometimes it was just neutral. Like they do that sometimes, but that just is like he's self-soothing himself. He likes to repeat Bluey over and over and over again because he likes it and it just helps him calm down. Have you guys heard any of these kinds of things when you're talking with folks? Okay. But we have to think of things in a new way if we want to be able to support these kinds of language processors and start thinking about them rather than verbal stems or maladaptive behavior, but as intentional communication. We have to assume meaning, just like we do with our AAC users who are punching buttons, and we say, oh, they're just, you go in the classroom and the teacher is like, oh, we took away his AAC device because he's just pushing buttons all the day. So the same way, whether they're a AAC user who's a Gestalt language processor, and we're kind of going to get into that at the end of the presentation, or they're a verbal communicator, we need to assume that what they're saying means something, and it's our job to figure it out. And this is really hard because we're not going to get help from our traditional language assessments with this, right? Because like we said, even things like language samples, if we approach them the way that we normally do with analytic language processors, we're going to attribute them to like a higher language development. We're going to say, oh, they have plural S, they have past tense ED, they understand all of this. Or we're going to just like negate all of their language and not really count it as anything, because the standardized tests, the assessments that we have are focused on kids who follow the A plus B plus C equals, formula. So we've got to think of it in a new way when we're approaching these kids. And the way that I would encourage you to think about it is to be a communication detective. One way that I want you to think about this too is that a lot of times we think of ourselves in communicators not as one or the other. We're either an analytic language processor or we're a Gestalt language processor. And they're a non-overlapping, mutually exclusive binary. But most of us engage in both models of language. And kiddos who start out as Gestalt language processors often get to the point where they're kind of operating in both worlds too. And the example that I give to this is that we all talk, or most of us do, talk in gestalts, and we have these scripts or these chunks that mean something different than if you were to just break down the chunks. And a lot of this is like maybe you have an inside joke with your like college roommates or something like that. the meme in the middle with the dog who is, with his coffee cup and he says, "This is fine." Like that is shorthand between my partner and I. Like when the house is like a disaster and the kids are like screaming at each other, we just like look at each other and we're like, "This is fine." And that is not, we're not saying this is fine. It is a direct reference to what that gestalt means to us. It's the context of this meme. Like, everything's burning down around us, but this is fine. So that's a gestalt that we use. And you can see that I'm an elder millennial with my Napoleon Dynamite and office memes up here, but these are like movie lines that you might repeat to a certain group of friends that they have meaning to you. Or you might generate these scripts because of an event that happened in a context. Like, for example, my mom, when she was a kid, was like on a Sunday drive with her family, and they got like off on a place where they weren't supposed to, and they could see where they wanted to be, but it was like they had no idea how to get there. And so somebody said, "If only we were on the other side." And now 2 generations later, like we still say, whenever we're in a situation where we know where we want to be, but we can't get there, someone in my family will say, "If only we were on the other side." And it has meaning because of the context and the way that it's been used. But that is not meaningful because of the specific words, but because of the connection that's made to the script. So it can be helpful to think about how you use gestalts because it can help maybe make it more relatable to how your kiddos that you're working with are communicating. Okay. Just a couple important factors to remember too is that males are more likely to use Gestalt language processors, and learning language through gestalts requires more steps than analytic language processing, and so it makes it slower. We're going to kind of get into what language development looks like for Gestalt language processors a little bit later, but that's an important thing to remember because our Gestalt language processors have a few extra steps before they're kind of at the place where analytic language processors begin. And so it can be, we just want to remember that so that as they're going through school and they're delayed, it's like, but they also had some extra work to get to where they are. Okay. If you are interested in learning more and kind of deep diving into Gestalt language processing, this is a great book to get into. It's written by Marge Blanc, and she breaks down the language development for Gestalt language processors, and she breaks it down into 4 stages, and I'm going to kind of give you the Cliff Notes version of that today. Okay, so Gestalt language GLP, we're talking about GLPs all the time, and now I'm talking about it in a completely different context. So it's not the kind of GLP that you're thinking of, but I'm going to use it because it is a little bit better shorthand. So in stage 1, I think of this as what we think of most when we think of our Gestalt language processors. Language is verbatim from other sources. So it's a direct copy paste. It can be songs, it can be scripts, it can be phrases. It's often taken from the media. They can be very short phrases like "we all fall down," or it can be an entire monologue from Bluey, right? So we don't interpret them literally, but we interpret them as communication. And the intonation in the original source should be considered when attempting to interpret the message. So if you have a suspicion that you have a Gestalt language processor on your hand, then you need to be a speech detective, a communication detective, and maybe you work in concert with parents or siblings and talk about, well, when they say this, when do they say it? When do you hear them say it? And then you can kind of start assigning meaning and mapping out what the gestalts mean. And that's going to be important because if you can respond and then echo back what they're saying to them in conventional language, then that will help them learn this and this are matching, and it will help them with pattern recognition. And the message is connected to the experience, not the literal message. So I'm going to play a video for you. And I have in my notes where to start it. So I'm going to take it out of slideshow mode. So this is an example of stage 1 Gestalt language processing. Here, and I might have to for Zoom, I think I have to make sure my settings. Bear with me here for a second, because when I put it on Zoom, I forgot that I have to. Yeah, okay. You know what? We might not be able to do the videos. Okay. Okay, give me 1 second and I'll see if I can. I might not be able to do it midstream. Like sometimes if you change your settings while you're already in the meeting, then it doesn't work, but. All right. I don't know. I'm trying to look for the setting that says share your. Okay. All right. Well, I don't think I'll be able to share my videos today. Sorry, guys. So we'll just skip through them. Let's see. Well, that's my microphone that's muted. But what I need to do is I need to share my audio through Zoom. But I think it will just take me a little bit too long to figure it out. So if you would like to see the videos, I can post the links and you guys can check them out. They're just examples of the difference. I have 3 videos and they're each, man, there's one at the end I really wanted to share. We'll see if I can figure it out. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm going to try one more thing.
Also brought an entire blanket out to the sand pit.
You can't hear anything, huh?
And you brought the pool has some rainwater in it. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? Okay, Tess?
What happened?
What happened? And you have two unicorns out here? Orange home. Fish? Fish.
So
So that was just
that's kind of an example. Here, let me mute myself again. All right, we'll do it that way. Okay. Okay, so supporting communication for those who are in GLP-1. So we want to provide models that are simple and easily understood, are functional, are meaningful across multiple contexts, and can be easily broken down. So you can kind of see some examples of this. So this is kind of almost modeling an easy pickup script. Let's go. Let's eat. Let's, so it's cueing them that this is something that can be used in routine. And so you can have examples of simple scripts, of modeling simple language that can be accessible through using it as a chunk, if that makes sense. And we always want to assume intent and meaning in children's language. So we don't want to dismiss it. Like I already said, we don't want to dismiss it. We want to seek to understand what might be the underlying function of the communication. That's kind of being that communication detective, looking at the patterns and seeing how we can derive meaning from what they're saying, and then make an effort to code the meaning of memorized phrases, echolalia, gestalts, scripts. So when you hear, do you want to build a snowman? That might mean I want to play with you. And so you receive the communication. Do you want to build a snowman? Oh, you want to play? I want to play with you. So you respond to the communication and validate what they're saying, and then also give them a new model that they could use. Okay, so GLP stage 2 is mitigated echolalia, and you can think of this stage as mix and match. So this is when they still have scripts, but they don't have to use their scripts exclusively in one big chunk. They can take the scripts, a little piece of this script and a piece of this script, and they start putting them together because they've learned maybe this piece of script means this, and this one means this, and so I'm going to start putting them together. And they can come from songs and memorized phrases and that kind of thing. And this is this little guy, this video, the quality of the video is poor, but I really love the example of how mom uses his script and reflects back to him. And also, I think it's a really good example of how he's kind of mixing and matching scripts.
Okay, what do you want to watch? You want to watch Clever Cars? Yes. I want to watch Clever Cars.
Okay.
Do any of you? Sorry. Do any of you? This is. Do any of you have kids like this? Yeah. Yeah, I have too. And he sits down and he says, okay, what do you want to watch? And do you think he knows, maybe he does, but do you think he knows the grammar that he's like created that novel sentence? Or do you think that's a script that yeah, but he's learned. And she says, okay, what do you want to watch? And he says in a very it's a functional but scripted response. I want to watch Clever Cars. And so he kind of has these facilitator phrases, and he's starting to mix and match them so his communication is more functional. All right, so when we're supporting communicators in this stage, in stage 2, we add mitigations, the actual broken down parts of a learned chunk. And so we're going to provide opportunities for them to use those new manipulated chunks and combine them in different ways. And so you might have chunk 1 and chunk 2 and chunk 3 and chunk 4. And what are some ways that you could combine these kind of scripts together? So with these combinations, you could have, let's get one chunk out of here, another chunk. Let's get out of here, and so you can show them how they can use that in multiple contexts. I want out of here. I want some more. So you have these kind of chunks that you're breaking down and using together so that they can say more. They have more control over their language because they can change things up a little bit. But it's still really script oriented in stage 2. All right. Now we get to GLP stage 3, and this is when they're able to isolate down to single words. So they're further broken down, and this is where you start to get into 2-word combinations. It's not and it might seem like you're going from more sophisticated to more simple, but when you're getting down to this point, then it's actually a good sign because it means that they're able to manipulate and they're starting to have more generative language themselves. They're not relying on memorized scripts. They're manipulating their units of language in a smaller way. All right. I'm going to skip this one and I'm going to go to the next one. In that video, it was the same girl that was in the first video, and mom says, we're going to go to the park. And she says, who is going to be there? And then she's able to list off like individual names of people, which is a point of progress from before when she would list off a script, but she was able to individually list off it. And Jody. And who else? And this person. So she had gotten to the point where she could use some single word manipulations there. So when we're thinking about supporting communication for GLP stage 3, this is when our language intervention is going to start looking more like language intervention for early language developers. So it's not really reinventing the wheel. It's just thinking about where you start doing this. You start after you kind of get through stage 1 and stage 2. So this is where we're doing responsive labeling. This is where we're doing parallel talk. For those of you who are speech language pathologists, this is kind of like language intervention 101. We're doing expansion. So if the child says dog, you add one thing to that utterance. So if child says dog, you might say big dog, or extension where the child says baby, and then the parent adds more information. She's sleepy. So really simple models again, but this is where we start. Usually this is the beginning, right? But for our Gestalt language processors, this is like phase 3 of intervention. So that's it's not reinventing the wheel. It's just knowing when we start here. And then GLP stage 4 to 6 is self-generated grammar. And this is like when kids start to generate original sentences. When they're first starting out, like in stage 4, it's the sentence generation lacks grammar. So they may at the beginning in stage 1 seem like they have a lot of grammatical morphemes, And then by stage 4, they're sounding more telegraphic, and you might think, is that a language regression? But if you kind of have that background and know what they're doing and how they're breaking down language so that they can build it to become, to do more with it, then you know they didn't lose skills, they're actually gaining skills. And so you kind of have to frame it in that perspective. So they might sound really telegraphic, like home, mom, me, go, school, me. And they might have been saying, let's get ready to rumble before. And that sounds really sophisticated, but this is actually progress. So it's kind of thinking about, what does progress look like for these kiddos? And this is when they'll require a wide variety of grammar models, and also intervention is going to look really similar to what it looks like for our kiddos who are like analytic typical develop, or analytic, I don't want to say typical developing. That was a slip. For kids, the kind of intervention we do for analytic language processors, we're using that here, but we just get here after a few more steps. Have any of you seen any of the documentaries or interviews with Owen and Ron Siskind? Owen is our friend who, I think he really helped with the understanding of Gestalt language processing. His dad is a journalist, and he memorized huge chunks of Disney movies and used them. And it took a while, but then his mom and dad realized, oh, he's actually not just repeating these Disney movies back to us. He's using them to meaningfully communicate. And so his parents kind of realized, like, oh, when he's talking about, when he's using the monologue from Scar at the Shadowlands, that's when he's feeling angry. And when he is using, and I'm going to show the video, but this is a really good example, I think, of a Gestalt language processor who's learned how to manipulate language. They can say single words, build their sentences, but they still use scripts to help them communicate. And so they're using both together. And so I have to remind myself, it's a long video, so I have to remind myself of where I need to start. Oops.
So tonight we have some very special guests. For those who
No, it's okay. Let's get it right. We'll share it. You know, so here's interesting. So you are doing this amazing thing of matching 50 movies, hundreds of hours, thousands of lyrics, to your life. Okay, yeah. Okay, it was really good. Also, the really good thing about autism is Owen can only tell the truth.
I can.
I wish I could say the same for my sources in Washington. Okay, so ready? Now we're going to do something right now. So what are some of the themes that you used when you were facing really a lot? What were some?
What do you think? What were some? Like Sword in the Stone. It's a Walt Disney Children's Family animated classic from 1963. You did. Yes, boy. It's the greatest fault on earth.
Power of love. A big theme of our hero here. Okay, so how?
I'll post that link. Here, let me. I'll post that link. So if you want to go back and see that video, it's really cool to see him go through the different scripts. And you can also see him switch from doing generative language where he's just talking in sentences. You can kind of see all the different stages of Gestalt language processing that he's using. So he kind of has carrier phrases in there. He's learned some of those, like when he's describing The Sword and the Stone and he's saying, it is a Walt Disney classic from 1963. That's memorized, but it's also, he's added his own thing, his own language to it. He's mixing and matching some scripts, and he's still using the full long scripts that he started out with in a meaningful way to communicate. And so that's kind of a good example of kind of Gestalt language processing 4 through 6. So what do we do to support processors in this stage? Well, we continue to use strategies that support early analytic language development. We're focusing on functional communication rather than grammar. We're not looking for perfect speech. We're looking for functional speech and communication. And we're going to provide an abundance of models, an abundance of context, and we're going to try to give a model just one step more sophisticated than what the child's output is. And we're going to provide context by pairing the language with visuals like books or actions or video clips, things that are meaningful to them, because it's only going to work if it's meaningful to them. Okay. I'm going to go through a few of these things quickly because there's a couple things I really want to get to. A lot of times when we're talking about both AAC planning and then also in the context of how we're approaching intervention for Gestalt language processors, we start here. We start with the vocabulary and the motor planning. For the motor planning, it's the speech. And we think, okay, what is the vocab that I want them to have? And then what's the motor planning, or the, for AAC, what's the display that they need? And we start here. And then we might move on to thinking about how they're processing their language. And then eventually we might get to that self-determination piece, which the self-determination piece is, what is it that is important to them? What is it that is motivating for them to communicate? What is the part that they want to share with us? What do they want to do? How do they want to do it? And then we eventually might start getting here after we've kind of looked at these other pieces. But I really think both within the context of AAC and when we're thinking about planning, this is for all of our kiddos, but really for our Gestalt language processors, is we really need to start here with the self-determination piece. And that's a part of being that communication detective, is what is important to these communicators. What are they trying to say to us? And we can learn what's important to them by what they pull out and what they decide they're going to mimic. But we can also see that in the context they're using it and how they're using it to communicate. And then from there, we can say, what kind of a processor are they? Are they an analytic language processor, or are they a Gestalt language processor? And then eventually, after we've kind of figured out those two pieces, then we start picking the vocabulary and the motor planning. We get there next at the very end, after we've determined what's most important to them and how are they processing language. If we start with the vocabulary and the motor planning, we're likely not going to be successful in supporting their intervention and their growth, because they're not going to be interested. It's not going to be meaningful to them. And there's not a lot of language, or there's not a lot of research yet about Gestalt language processing. It's really hard to study. But what we do know is that relationships and context are super important for these kiddos. And we see that there are only certain people that they may communicate with, because that's meaningful to them. And they know that that person is going to listen when they're talking, and that person is going to respond to them when they're communicating, and they've given up on other people. And so when we're thinking about that self-determination piece, if we pose ourselves and make ourselves be a responsive person, we're more likely to understand what they need. All right. Okay. I did put the wrong slideshow. I'm teaching a class and I gave them an abbreviated version. I'm going to pull up my other one. Because I have a couple of slides in a short few minutes that have to do with AAC and Gestalt Language Processing. Okay, here they are. You guys have been awesome bearing with me. All right. So for supporting GLP-1s who use AAC, we're going to try to program some chunks of language. And if you have a child who's a Gestalt language processor and they have problems with motor speech, you might not know what their scripts are because they're not able to say them. And so that's obviously a challenge. But if you have a suspicion that that's the kind of processor your kiddo is, then you can process those chunks and scripts and model them as chunks and scripts. In stage 2, when we're getting into mix and matching, this is the hardest part. This is the hardest stage for using AAC because it's really hard to program the breakdown of scripts, right? We can, and it has to kind of happen naturally. If you have kids who are using verbal speech, it happens naturally. So it's hard, but you could try to break down scripts that they've used and model kind of like a broken down version of scripts they've already have. See if you can program scripts that are used like in their routines that they already are exposed to. And then also you can use visual screen displays as an AAC display. We often don't look to those. I think all of the visual or all of the AAC that we're using in my district is grid-based. And I was just talking to our team, one of our team members, and I said, when I was prepping for this, that's one of the things that I am going to be looking at is like for these kiddos who are more Gestalt language processors, I'm going to be looking at visual screen displays because if they see a picture and then they can touch something in context, that might give them more meaning. And then for GLPs in stage 3, model simple word-to combos. Don't worry about grammar yet and make it meaningful to them. This is not super different than just regular support for AAC. And then in stage 4, use the same interventions that you would for analytic language learners. Assume all the time that there's meaning, assume that they are trying to say something to you and that they're not just messing around, and model, and provide opportunities to use AAC while respecting their autonomy. Some challenges with AAC system layouts, which is some of the things that we talked about, is the vocabulary organization schemes. They're really designed for people who are GLP 2 or 3 or later, really 3 or later when they've gotten to single words. And they lack some of the limited features is the recorded audio. It's difficult to embed video sometimes, and that can be really helpful, but consider visual scene displays. TD Snap has an option for a visual scene display. Seen and Heard is an app that has visual scene display, and Scene Speak is another one. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding anything that we went over today? You guys have been really, really great. And I will, before I get off, I'll post the links in the chat for you, and I'll I'll talk with Austin to see if I can post the link somewhere. Yes. Visual scene display? Visual scene display. And so what that looks like is it just has a picture. So it might have a picture of a restaurant, and then you can circle hot spots on that picture for glass or food or door or bathroom. And the word is associated with the spot on the picture where that thing is. So it's even more in context than just like a picture of a bathroom. Or you could have you can have the visual scenes be pictures of your classroom, of the child's classroom, so it really contextualizes the vocabulary. All right. Okay, thank you so much.